Hi, everyone. So today I wanted to talk about what we were going to talk about last time, which is mortal sin. And I've had an accusation more than once that I don't really know what mortal sin is, because my advice is that people should not participate in any way in an invalid wedding, which is a mortal sin. And people say, well, but you don't know what a mortal sin is. Okay, so let's talk about that because I do know what a mortal sin is. And in fact, I've been teaching the faith for 27 years since my reversion. And one thing that we did when I taught RCIA for several years was explain the three conditions of a mortal sin. What makes a sin mortal? What makes a sin deadly? Where literally you have no more grace in your soul. After baptism, you commit this sin that is so bad that you actually break friendship with God, you lose the sanctifying grace in your soul, and you will go to hell if you are in that state of mortal sin. So I definitely have and do know about the three conditions for mortal sin. So I'm gonna tell you the three conditions, which most of you probably already know, but then I want to discuss why it is not helpful to always parse a sin. Okay, so we know that for a sin to be mortal, it has to be a sin that is of grave matter. So that means a very serious sin. The person committing the sin has to know and have the knowledge that it's a grave matter. And the person committing the sin has to commit the sin with full consent of his will. Okay, those three conditions have to be met before you actually lose that grace in your soul, and cannot live in heaven with God. And so you would have to go to confession, to get back into a state of grace. So yes, I do know what a mortal sin is, and I do know those conditions. The conditions are very important for the theologian, for the academic, for objectively to have this knowledge of the faith. Where it is not so helpful is when we try to use those conditions to apply to a situation that we are trying to get around. Okay, so what do I mean by that? So it is one thing to say, gosh, wow. So before my reversion, when I was 27 years old, I had committed lots of mortal sins. Now, I will just say that outright. I committed mortal sins. I could sit around and say, but was I really going to hell? Like, did I actually know it was a grave matter? Did I, was it a grave matter? And did I do it with full consent of my will? And would I have gone to hell or wouldn't I have gone to hell? I mean, it's very fascinating academic discussion to have. However, that's looking back in retrospect. When we are trying to look at ourselves or what someone is doing now, when we try to just simply apply those three conditions, we might want to look at why we're doing that. Like, why, if we see, for example, let's say we see our niece going to get an abortion, and do we sit around going, well, it's maybe it's not a mortal sin. Maybe it's not a mortal sin because she might not know that it's grave. She might not have the knowledge. She might not, be doing it with full consent of her will. And then what? Do we just sit back and let it happen? Or do we try to intervene because it is a mortal sin? Whether or not she fits all the criteria of that, we're going to leave that up to God. But we know that it is a deadly, deadly sin, a serious sin that certainly risks her soul. Even on the plane of just natural law, like in our hearts, we know you don't rip a baby out of the womb. So, was she coerced? Okay, yeah, that might be a big factor. Someone forced her to get it. But even so, she's going to have the residual effects of a dead baby, and this on her heart and conscience for the rest of her life. So, this academic exercise of, well, it might not be a mortal sin for her. Would you then drive her to the abortion clinic because she doesn't fully understand that it's a deadly issue, grave matter? Or, of course you wouldn't, because you're Catholic. You're a devout Catholic. So when we are devout Catholics and we are trying in the present moment to legalize away a deadly sin, which would could send us or others to hell, we really have to look at our motives. What are we doing? Why are we trying to lessen or downgrade a sin that is of grave matter that we used to, or we could simply call a mortal sin, which just means deadly sin? What is our point with that? So what are we trying to do? Again, once we taught our students in RCIA what a deadly sin was, this is a sin, that's a sin, contraception, sterilization, all these things. Then they knew. Once they know, right? They can't unknow what they've been taught. They could reject it, refuse it, but that doesn't mean they haven't been given the knowledge. So we knew that once we built the case for the church, and then we gave them the hard teachings later on in the course of months, we would always say, my co teacher and I, boy, this is the hard part, because now we're going to tell them today, like tonight's the night we're going to teach them about contraception, and then they're culpable. So once they know, they're culpable. So anyway, back to things like even attending invalid weddings. If you've raised your children in the Catholic faith, they will know that, hopefully, that you don't get married outside the church. So they have the knowledge. If they reject it, they reject it. But you should not go looking for excuses for them. And you should not look for excuses and say, well, since they maybe probably don't know or don't believe it, which who cares if they don't believe it? If they know, they know. Then it still doesn't give you permission to participate, just like you wouldn't participate in an abortion, just like you wouldn't participate in a drug party or a voodoo ordination. What are we looking for when we say about all these three conditions of mortal sin? If we keep bringing it up as devout Catholics, why? So I'm going to put in the show notes a link to Father David Nix did a wonderful talk on the new Jansenism. And basically it is about this. It is about taking something good, which is theological knowledge, and applying it in ways that maybe we're looking to be legalistic. We're looking to get around God's mercy and trying to escape kind of around the edges to so that we're not judged and we don't go to hell. But why would we do that as devout Catholics? Okay, we're not about that. We're not about legalism. So what I wanted to mention was, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes. He speaks of this kind of as having these loopholes or these caveats, this legalism, terms that we like to use, things like didn't have full knowledge, didn't have full consent of the will, reduced culpability, primacy of conscience, invincible ignorance. So we all hear these, Father Nick says, we all hear these as to why sins are not sins anymore. But none of those conditions make the sin not a sin or not offensive to God. It's still offensive to God. All these things are offensive to God, even if the person truly is invincibly ignorant. The objective act of it is still grave matter, whatever this, deadly sin is. Thomas Aquinas, as Father David Nick said, doesn't mess around by using all these caveats, even though surely he knew about them and surely they're valid. But he would say, like, this is a mortal sin, this is a venial sin, this is a mortal sin, this is a venial sin. He used the term mortal sin. It's okay for us to use the term mortal sin when we're talking about deadly sins that could send people to hell. If we have to constantly talk about the conditions and, well, are we really sure? And again, why are we doing that? What's the point of it other than to get around it and to do something that we wouldn't do if everybody knew how deadly and offensive these sins were? Why would we want to do that, though? Why would we as Catholics try to skirt the moral law or make excuses? Aren't we more concerned about loving God, and never wanting to offend him? So the legalism is a real problem. And we don't want to teach our children to play these games with sin. So, again, when people say, you don't know what mortal sin is, Layla, yes, I do. And I know that we don't play around with it. And I know that we don't play legalistic games with it. And I know that even if our children or whoever we want to defend might be in deadly sin, but we don't know for sure, we certainly don't act as if, well, they probably don't know anyway, so I'm just going to go along with whatever they're doing because they don't really know. No, because that we're still culpable. So there's this little story. I'll finish up by saying there's this story that JP2 apparently on one of the ad limina visits of a group of bishops from somewhere, and maybe it was America. I don't even know if this is a true story, but it'll make the point. They said, well, Holy Father, we got the people, the flock, they don't understand. They don't have the knowledge, they don't have the understanding that contraception and, that's just wrong, that it's just really, really deadly sinful. It's, they just don't know. And I guess the legend goes that St. John Paul II kind of nodded and looked at those bishops and said, yeah, they don't know, but you do. But you do. So in other words, they're culpable, right? They're culpable. They didn't teach there. They're going along with the ignorance. They're not trying to get people out of their ignorance. So these games that we play with legalism and, well, they don't know and nobody, well, you know. And so let's talk about mortal sin as mortal sin so that we're not trying to make sin look less than it is. Deadly sin, for all intents and purposes, can kill the soul. We'll leave it to God and someone else's spiritual director, whether or not they're culpable for something in the past that they've done. If it's today and if it's now, whoever's discussing this and knows enough that there are 3 conditions to mortal sin is devout enough to know that we don't try to find excuses to get out of the culpability of what we already know. So with devout people trying to parse it down or trying to split hairs, that is a dangerous game. And I would say it's not a game that God would smile upon. We avoid mortal sin and we don't excuse it and we don't look for ways out of it so that we can get around it. We just say, don't commit mortal sin. And we can speak like even Thomas Aquinas did. Mortal sin is mortal sin. Don't mess around with it. Okay. Thank you so much for listening. I know this is not fun, but it's important.